My name is Hazel. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like steady, reliable, and my personal favorite, easygoing. I live in a quiet coastal city, work in a field that requires precision and patience, and I've always been the kind of woman people trust with details. I remember birthdays, I double check contracts, I show up early. What I've learned over time is that when you are calm, people assume you're harmless. When you don't raise your voice, they assume you don't have limits. When you forgive quickly, they assume you'll tolerate anything. That assumption followed me everywhere, into friendships, into family dynamics, and eventually into my own engagement. This story is about my wedding. More specifically, it's about my sister, my older sister, who tried to sabotage it, and about the hour before the ceremony when I removed her as my maid of honor. But this isn't a story about screaming matches or dramatic confrontations in white dresses. It's not about revenge, and it's not about humiliation. No one was dragged out, no champagne was thrown, no one was publicly exposed. Drama didn't make it down the aisle. What did make it down the aisle was clarity. The journey to that hour didn't begin with one explosive moment. It began years earlier, with small comments disguised as jokes, with subtle shifts in tone, with roles assigned without my consent. It began with being the reasonable one, the mature one, the one who would understand. And for a long time, I did understand, until I realized understanding had slowly turned into permission. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to tell you what really happened, not just on the wedding day, but in the months leading up to it. I'll tell you how I started noticing patterns I had ignored, how silence, once a habit, became a strategy, and how removing someone from your bridal party isn't always about punishment. It can be about protection. I won't exaggerate, I won't villainize, I won't pretend I was perfect. I'll tell it exactly as it unfolded, quietly, steadily, and without spectacle. Because sometimes the most powerful shift in a family isn't loud. It's the moment the quiet one decides she's done carrying everyone else's noise. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you chose not to be loud? In my family, I was the dependable one. My sister, Eleanor, was the vibrant one, the magnetic one, the one who walked into a room and rearranged its energy without trying. She was 2 years older than me, and from the time we were children, she was described as spirited. That word followed her like a spotlight. I was described as mature. When Eleanor forgot her homework, it was because she was creative and distracted by bigger thoughts. When I forgot something, rarely, it was surprising, out of character, a crack in the image. At family dinners, Eleanor told stories. I refilled glasses. At holidays, she chose the music. I helped Mum in the kitchen. At birthdays, she picked the restaurant. I made sure everyone had a ride home. No one assigned these roles out loud. They just formed. And once a role forms in a family, it calcifies. By the time we were in our 20s, it was an unspoken understanding. Eleanor was emotion, I was logistics. When I started working in compliance, the irony wasn't lost on me. My job required identifying risks before they became problems. It required reading the fine print, noticing inconsistencies, anticipating fallout. I was good at it because I had been doing it socially for years, smoothing tension, preempting conflict, absorbing friction before it sparked. People mistook that for passivity. Even my fiancé, Daniel, once told me gently that he admired how I never let things get to you. I didn't correct him. It wasn't that things didn't get to me. It was that I processed them privately. At family gatherings, if Eleanor teased me about being predictable or the human calendar, everyone laughed. I laughed too. It was easier. I had learned early that correcting a joke makes you look sensitive, and sensitivity in my family was Eleanor's domain. The thing about being the reliable one is that you become infrastructure. People lean on you without noticing. They assume your presence. They assume your forgiveness. When Daniel proposed, Eleanor cried the loudest. She hugged me dramatically in front of everyone and announced she'd finally get to plan a wedding properly. It was said with affection, wrapped in champagne bubbles and applause. Everyone thought it was sweet. I heard something else. Not malicious, not yet, just territorial. But I brushed it aside. Because that's what I did. I translated sharp edges into harmless shapes. I told myself she was excited. I told myself this was how sisters bonded. When I asked her to be my maid of honor, it felt inevitable. There was no version of the story where I didn't. It would have raised questions. It would have looked cold. And I wasn't cold. I was hopeful. Hopeful that adulthood had softened us. Hopeful that the wedding would be something we shared, not something she performed. Hopeful that the roles we grew up with wouldn't follow us into this new chapter. I didn't yet understand that roles don't dissolve just because you put on a white dress. Sometimes they tighten. And the dependable one? She's expected to carry the weight beautifully. The first small cut didn't draw blood. That's the thing about subtle disrespect. It doesn't announce itself. It slips in smiling. We were sitting in a cafe near the seafront in Brighton. Wedding magazines spread between us. My leather planner open to a carefully tabbed section labeled Wedding. Master timeline. Eleanor had insisted we start planning early. If we're doing this, she said, we're doing it properly. I remember feeling grateful, supported, maybe even a little relieved. I had already chosen the venue with Daniel, a restored glass conservatory overlooking the water. It was light-filled, understated, elegant. Very us. When I showed Eleanor the photos, she tilted her head. "Oh," she said, "it's minimal." I smiled. That's the point." She nodded slowly. "Of course, it's just that with your personality, I thought you might want something with a bit more presence." There it was. Light, playful, almost complimentary. But something about the phrasing lodged in me. With your personality. As if mine required enhancement. As if subtlety was a deficit. I brushed it off. I told myself she just preferred bold aesthetics. That sisters don't always have the same taste. That disagreement isn't disrespect. Then came the dress appointment. I had booked a private fitting at a small boutique I'd researched for weeks. Clean lines, structured silk, nothing theatrical. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes late, breathless, carrying takeaway coffee and energy that filled the room. The first dress I stepped into felt like quiet certainty. When I walked out, the consultant's eyes softened. Daniel's mom pressed her hand to her chest. Eleanor looked at me, head tilted again. "It's very you," she said. "Safe." The word hit differently this time. Safe. Not elegant, not timeless, not beautiful. Safe. Everyone else continued admiring the stitching, the way the fabric moved. Eleanor stood, walked around me slowly, then addressed the consultant. "Do you have anything with more drama? Maybe a lower back, or something that would surprise people?" I felt the air shift, not violently, just enough. I laughed. "I don't need to surprise anyone." She smiled brightly. "But it's your wedding, Haz. Don't you want to make an entrance?" That was the first moment I realized we weren't picturing the same day. To me, the wedding was a promise, a ceremony, a room full of steady love. To her, it was an event. Still, nothing she said was cruel. Nothing was overtly hostile. If I had voiced discomfort, it would have sounded petty, oversensitive. So I did what I always did. I translated. She's trying to elevate things. She wants it to feel special. She just expresses excitement differently. And to be fair, she also did helpful things. She created a shared spreadsheet. She researched florists. She offered to handle coordination with the bridesmaids. Her involvement was undeniable, which made the small comments harder to isolate. At dinner one night, she joked in front of friends. "Hazel would elope if I let her. I'm basically saving this wedding from being a corporate seminar." Everyone laughed. I did too. But later, when I replayed it in my mind, I noticed something. Every joke positioned her as the visionary, me as the reluctant participant. The wedding was slowly becoming something she was shaping, and I was permitting. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't wound you deeply. It conditions you. It nudges the narrative just enough that you begin questioning your own instincts. I told myself it wasn't serious, that sisters tease, that planning is stressful. But I started writing things down in my planner, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, comments, decisions that had shifted after her input. I didn't know why I was documenting it. I just knew I wanted clarity. Because the cut was small, but I had started to feel it. There's a quiet danger in patterns. One isolated comment can be dismissed, two can be coincidence. But when something repeats, softly, consistently, it begins to shape reality. After the dress appointment, I noticed a rhythm forming. It happened in group chats first. I had created one for the bridesmaids. Simple, organized, timelines pinned at the top. Eleanor quickly became the most active voice. She sent inspiration photos, none of which resembled what I'd chosen. She'd follow them with, "Just ideas, we'll see if Hazel's feeling brave." The wink made it untouchable. If I responded with, "I actually prefer the original concept," she'd reply, "Of course you do, babe. Classic Hazel." Classic. Predictable. Safe. It became a refrain. When we toured florists, I described soft white arrangements with greenery. Eleanor leaned toward the florist and said, "She says that now, but she panics about being boring. Maybe add something unexpected." I didn't panic about being boring. But now the florist was looking at me differently, evaluating, adjusting. I began to notice something subtle but powerful. Eleanor wasn't opposing me directly. She was reframing me. She was introducing doubt about my own preferences, publicly, lightly, repeatedly. And because I didn't contradict her forcefully, it began to stick. Friends started asking, "Are you sure you don't want something a bit more statement?" Daniel's aunt suggested, "Your sister has such a good eye for flair." Even my mom said once, gently, "It's sweet how she's helping you come out of your shell." Out of my shell. I wasn't in a shell, but I could feel myself shrinking. Not because she was louder, but because I was rationalizing. I told myself she'd always been expressive, that this was her love language, that maybe I was overly cautious, that maybe a wedding required more spectacle than I naturally gravitated toward. It's strange how easily self-trust erodes, not through attack, but through suggestion. There was one evening that lingers with me. We were finalizing the bridesmaids' dresses. I had chosen a muted sage, elegant, soft, cohesive with the venue. Eleanor sent a link to a completely different style in a deep emerald satin. "This would pop so much better in photos," she wrote. I responded, "I think sage aligns better with the overall look." She replied in the group chat, "See, she's allergic to risk." The others reacted with laughing emojis. I stared at my phone longer than I should have. Allergic to risk. I worked in compliance. My entire career was built on calculated risk. I invested wisely. I'd moved cities alone at 24. I had chosen a partner thoughtfully, not impulsively. But somehow, in the narrative forming around the wedding, I was becoming timid, and I let it happen. Because correcting it felt heavy, because pushing back felt like escalating something that was just jokes, because I didn't want to be the difficult bride. That label hovers over women like a threat, so I stayed calm, polite, measured. I began noticing how often I prefaced my preferences with softeners. "I might be wrong, but maybe it's silly, but I don't mind either way." The truth was I did mind, but I had normalized the small cuts. I had accepted that being the dependable one meant absorbing friction, that my steadiness required tolerance, that harmony was worth the cost of self-expression. Eleanor wasn't shouting. She wasn't sabotaging yet. She was reshaping the narrative of who I was in my own wedding, and I was still telling myself it was harmless. But somewhere beneath the calm, something was recording the pattern, not emotionally. Precisely. There's a moment in every family dynamic when you realize you're not just participating in a role, you're maintaining it. For me, that moment came during a Sunday lunch at my parents' house. The dining table was crowded with half-finished plates and overlapping conversations. My father was describing parking complications at the conservatory venue. My mom was worried about the guest list exceeding capacity. Eleanor was scrolling through her phone, occasionally interjecting with dramatic sighs about how weddings always spiral. I was answering questions, reassuring, clarifying timelines. "It's handled," I said for the third time. The venue coordinator confirmed the seating layout. Dad nodded, visibly relieved. Mum relaxed into her chair. Eleanor looked up from her phone and smiled at me in that almost admiring way she had. "See, this is why Hazel's the bride," she said lightly. "She loves spreadsheets more than romance." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, but this time something inside me didn't translate it, because I saw it clearly. I wasn't being framed as the woman in love. I was being framed as the project manager of my own wedding, and she was the emotional centerpiece. Later that afternoon, Mum pulled me aside in the kitchen while Eleanor took a call in the garden. "It's so good your sister's helping," she said softly. "You'd never make a fuss on your own." I looked at her carefully. "Do you think I need someone to make a fuss?" She hesitated, not maliciously, just honestly. "You've always been happy to let others shine." That sentence followed me home. I realized then that the role assigned to me wasn't accidental. I was the stabilizer, the rational one, the quiet backbone, which sounds noble until you notice what it excludes. It excludes attention. It excludes emotional space. It excludes being centered in your own milestones. I began noticing how often decisions were redirected through Eleanor. Vendors would ask her opinions even when I was standing beside her. Bridesmaids would message her privately to confirm plans I had already finalized. It wasn't because she overruled me outright. It was because she occupied the spotlight naturally, and I didn't contest it. There was one specific incident that crystallized it. We were meeting the photographer. I had chosen someone whose style was documentary, intimate, unobtrusive. During the consultation, Eleanor leaned forward and said, "Just make sure you capture Hazel when she lets loose. It doesn't happen often." The photographer laughed politely. I didn't. I realized in that second that I was being subtly painted as a restrained version of myself, someone who needed unlocking. At my own wedding, that night, I opened my leather planner and flipped through the pages I'd been filling over the past weeks. Comments, patterns, redirected decisions, language used repeatedly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, but it was consistent. And consistency is evidence. I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I removed Eleanor from this process entirely, what would actually collapse? The answer surprised me. Very little. The spreadsheets were mine. The contracts were signed by me and Daniel. The deposits were paid from our account. The vision, no matter how gently mocked, was intact. What she provided wasn't structure, it was narrative control. And I had allowed it because it felt easier than correcting her. Because challenging a role in a family feels like rewriting history. But something subtle shifted that day. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being too sensitive and started asking whether I was being too accommodating. There's a difference. One keeps peace, the other erases you. The shift didn't happen in an argument. It didn't happen after a cruel remark or a dramatic confrontation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, alone in my flat, with rain pressing softly against the windows. Daniel was working late. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional. I had my planner open in front of me, not to document anything this time, just to review timelines. Final fittings, seating chart confirmations, vendor payment schedule. Everything was in place. Objectively, the wedding was running smoothly. So why did it feel like I was bracing for something? I closed the planner and leaned back. I replayed the past few months, not emotionally, but structurally. Every moment where I'd felt slightly displaced, every time I softened a preference, every joke that reframed me. Then I asked myself something I hadn't dared to articulate. If Eleanor weren't my sister, if she were just a friend behaving this way, would I tolerate it? The answer was immediate. No. That clarity startled me. I wasn't upset. I wasn't even angry. I was simply certain. There's a difference between enduring discomfort because you're unsure and enduring it because you believe you must. I had mistaken obligation for love, and in doing so, I had slowly accepted a diminished version of my own presence. I stood and walked to the hallway mirror, not dramatically, just thoughtfully. I looked like myself, calm, composed, capable, not fragile, not overshadowed, just quiet. And I realized something almost embarrassingly simple. I didn't need Eleanor's energy to elevate my wedding. I didn't need contrast to be interesting. I didn't need volume to validate my joy. The insecurity I had been managing wasn't about aesthetics. It was about authorship. Who was this wedding for? Who was shaping its tone? Who was allowed to define me inside it? For months I had been responding, adjusting, translating. That night I decided I would observe instead. Not confront, not accuse, observe. If there was something intentional in her behavior, it would reveal itself. If it was unconscious, patterns would still surface. But I would no longer participate in minimizing myself to maintain comfort. The shift wasn't loud. It was an internal recalibration. The next morning, Eleanor called to discuss final details for the hen party. She was animated, brimming with plans I hadn't approved. Normally, I would have negotiated gently. This time, I simply listened. I didn't correct her immediately. I didn't reassure her. I didn't soften. I just said, "Send me the full plan when it's finalized." There was a brief pause on the other end. "You're very chill about this," she said. "I am," I replied. And I meant it, because calmness, when chosen deliberately, feels different from calmness used as a shield. That was the day something shifted. Not between us yet, but within me. I stopped trying to be understood and started preparing to be decisive. Once silence becomes intentional, it changes texture. Before, my quietness had been reflexive, an automatic smoothing of edges. Now it was deliberate. I wasn't withdrawing, I was watching, and the difference unsettled her. Eleanor was used to immediate feedback from me. If she made a suggestion, I'd respond. If she teased, I'd laugh. If she redirected a decision, I'd negotiate softly. When I stopped doing that, she filled the space. It began with small things. In the bridesmaids' group chat, she proposed upgrading the hen party venue to a boutique hotel outside the city for the aesthetic. It would nearly double the budget. Previously, I would have responded with a detailed breakdown of costs and a diplomatic alternative. This time I wrote, "Please share a full budget comparison first. No emojis, no cushioning." She replied 5 minutes later, "Wow, okay, CFO." A few laughing reactions followed. I didn't defend myself. I didn't soften it with a smiley face. I simply waited for the budget comparison. It never came. Instead, the idea quietly dissolved. That was the first time I saw something clearly. When I didn't immediately absorb the momentum of her enthusiasm, it lost force. Silence, when it refuses to validate, reveals substance. At a cake tasting appointment, she arrived with 3 new flavor combinations she'd pre-discussed with the baker. I listened as she described them: lavender honey, pistachio rose, dark chocolate chili. The baker looked to me for confirmation. "They sound creative," I said evenly, "but we'll proceed with the original selection." No apology, no explanation. Eleanor blinked at me, surprised. "You're sure? It's your one chance to be bold." "I don't need bold," I replied calmly. "I need it to feel like us." She studied me for a moment longer than usual. There was no scene, no raised voices, but something had shifted in the dynamic. She was testing for friction, and finding none. Because friction requires resistance with emotion. I was offering none. At home, Daniel noticed the change first. "You seem lighter," he said one evening. "I stopped debating things that aren't up for debate," I told him. He smiled, almost proud. "Good." What I didn't tell him yet was that I had started documenting again, not just comments, but actions. Vendor calls made without me present, bridesmaid conversations redirected, subtle narrative shifts, not to weaponize them, but to understand the pattern fully before acting. When you work in compliance, you learn that evidence isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about removing ambiguity. One afternoon, I overheard Eleanor on speakerphone with one of the bridesmaids. "She'll go along with it," she said casually. "Hazel hates confrontation." I didn't interrupt. I didn't announce that I had heard. I simply wrote it down later. Not as betrayal, as data. That evening, I realized something else. She wasn't escalating because I was quiet. She was escalating because she believed I would always remain quiet. And assumptions, when left unchallenged, grow comfortable. The wedding was now 2 weeks away. Everything was confirmed. Deposits paid, seating finalized. From the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, the air had changed. I wasn't angry. I was clear. And clarity doesn't rush. It waits for the moment when silence is no longer misread as weakness, but revealed as preparation. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like routine. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything appeared settled. The venue confirmations were printed and filed. The caterer's final head count was locked. The seating chart had been emailed and approved. From the outside, I was exactly who I had always been: organized, calm, accommodating. What no one noticed was that I had quietly shifted access. Every vendor contract had originally listed both my number and Eleanor's, because at the beginning, I had trusted collaboration. Now I began reviewing each agreement carefully. The photographer's contract allowed for a designated point of contact on the wedding day. I updated it to Daniel. The venue coordinator requested a final logistics liaison. I confirmed it would be my cousin Amara, steady, discreet, and not emotionally invested in the spotlight. The florist asked about last-minute aesthetic decisions. I clarified in writing that all design adjustments required direct approval from me. No drama, no announcements, just clarity. I didn't remove Eleanor from the role of maid of honor. Not yet. On paper, she still held the title. She still attended fittings. She still posted excited countdowns on social media. But operationally, she was no longer steering anything. It was subtle enough that she didn't notice at first. Then came the hen party weekend. She had planned most of it, at least publicly. I had approved the guest list and the budget in writing, but I let her handle the tone. I wanted to observe how far she would go when she believed I wouldn't push back. The weekend was elegant on the surface, a rented townhouse, champagne, coordinated silk pajamas for photographs. But beneath it, there was something performative. During dinner, she stood to give a speech. To Hazel, she began, raising her glass, who finally decided to live a little. The table laughed softly. I smiled. She continued, "We all know she'd marry a spreadsheet if she could, so let's thank Daniel for pulling her into the real world." More laughter. I watched the room carefully. No one thought it was cruel. It was delivered warmly, playfully, but it wasn't accurate, and it wasn't new. It was a polished version of the same narrative she'd been building for months. I didn't correct her. Instead, I made a mental note of who looked uncomfortable. Two bridesmaids avoided eye contact. Amara's jaw tightened slightly. Daniel's sister shifted in her seat. Data. Later that night, Eleanor insisted on a series of staged wild bride photos, feather boas, oversized sunglasses, exaggerated poses. "This will prove you can loosen up," she teased. I participated briefly, smiled when necessary. Then I stepped away. "I'm going to turn in," I said calmly. "Big week ahead." She looked almost disappointed. "You're no fun tonight." I held her gaze steadily. "I'm exactly enough." That was the only direct sentence I gave her all weekend. When I returned home, I reviewed everything again, not emotionally, but structurally. She wasn't trying to ruin the wedding in an obvious way. She was positioning herself as its emotional engine, and me as its restrained beneficiary. But here's what she never noticed. The vendors now called me directly for confirmations. The day of schedule listed Amara as point of contact. The payments were secured, the authority lines were clear. And most importantly, I was no longer reacting. Preparation isn't loud. It doesn't posture. It rearranges foundations quietly. The wedding was 5 days away, and for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anxiety, not resentment, control. The private reveal didn't come from a confession. It came from a mistake. 3 days before the wedding, I received an email from the venue coordinator with the subject line, "Updated floor plan, as discussed with Eleanor." I hadn't discussed any updates. I opened the attachment calmly. The layout had changed. The sweetheart table Daniel and I had chosen, intimate, slightly off-center to allow for movement, had been replaced with a long head table, elevated, positioned as a focal stage. The DJ booth had been moved closer to the dining area. The lighting plan had shifted from warm ambient to brighter uplighting. It was subtle to an untrained eye, but it altered the tone entirely. I scrolled further down. In the email thread below, I saw Eleanor's message. "Hazel tends to default to understated. I think she'll thank us later if we make it feel bigger. Let's go ahead and adjust." There it was. Not a joke, not a tease. Authority assumed. I didn't feel anger. I felt something cleaner. Confirmation. I replied to the coordinator within minutes. "Please revert to the original approved floor plan. Any design or layout changes require my written consent. Thank you." Professional. Direct. The coordinator responded apologetically. "Of course, Hazel. I assumed Eleanor had your approval." I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment. It wasn't about the table. It was about authorship. Eleanor hadn't just been reframing me socially. She had begun making executive decisions. Decisions framed as upgrades, as improvements, as necessary corrections to my supposed restraint. And she hadn't told me. That omission mattered more than the change itself. Later that afternoon, another notification surfaced, this time from the photographer. Just confirming timeline adjustment per Eleanor's suggestion, extended bridal party entrance for dynamic shots. I hadn't approved that either. I called the photographer calmly. "We'll stick to the original timeline," I said. "No extended entrances." There was a pause. "Understood," he replied carefully. 2 data points in one day. Not dramatic sabotage, not malicious chaos, but deliberate expansion. She wasn't trying to destroy the wedding. She was trying to reshape it into something that centered spectacle. And by extension, herself. That evening, she called me, voice bright. "I spoke to the venue about elevating the energy a bit. You'll love it." "I've already reverted it," I replied evenly. Silence. "Oh," she said, "but you didn't like the idea?" "I prefer the plan Daniel and I chose." Another pause. "You're being very rigid about this." I considered that word. "Rigid?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm being clear." She exhaled lightly. "I was just trying to help you not underplay your own wedding." I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "I don't feel underplayed." And for the first time, she didn't have a joke ready. After we hung up, I opened my planner again. 2 unauthorized changes. 2 reversions. Pattern confirmed. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was structural. I now had documented evidence that she was operating beyond her role. Not maliciously enough to cause public outrage, but clearly enough to justify intervention. The wedding was 72 hours away, and clarity had replaced doubt entirely. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. There's a moment before any irreversible choice where time feels unusually quiet. 2 days before the wedding, I sat at the small oak desk in our bedroom, my planner open, phone face down beside it. The house was still. Daniel had taken the afternoon off to finalize a few personal vows revisions in the study. Outside, the sky hung low and gray over Brighton, the sea barely visible through the mist. I wasn't panicked. I was evaluating. On paper, Eleanor was still my maid of honor. Publicly, nothing had fractured. If I did nothing, the ceremony would proceed. She would stand beside me, smile in photos, give a speech, likely polished, charming, slightly reframing. The guests would never know. Option 1, ignore it. Maintain peace. Absorb the discomfort for one day. Option 2, confront her privately, demand alignment, trust that she would step back. Option 3, redefine the boundary entirely. I examined each like a contract clause. If I ignored it, I would be consenting to the narrative she'd built. I would stand at the altar aware that the person beside me had attempted to override my decisions twice without transparency. Not catastrophic, but misaligned. If I confronted her and kept her in the role, I would be gambling on her ability to relinquish control in a moment designed for visibility. I knew her patterns. Under pressure, she expanded, not contracted. Which left the third option, removing her. Not from the wedding, not from my life, but from the position of symbolic proximity. It wasn't about punishment, it was about authorship. A maid of honor isn't just a logistical title, she is the person who stands closest. The person who signs the register. The person whose presence signals trust. And trust, once structurally compromised, requires recalibration. I asked myself one final question. If I do this, can I do it calmly? If the answer had been no, I wouldn't have proceeded. But the answer was yes. There was no heat in me, no desire to embarrass her, no impulse to expose the emails publicly. Just clarity. I walked into the study and told Daniel everything, factually, the floor plan, the timeline, the phrasing in the emails. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said quietly, "What do you want your wedding day to feel like?" "Steady," I replied. "And does she make it feel steady?" I didn't hesitate. "No." He nodded once. "Then you already know." It wasn't dramatic. He didn't fuel anger. He didn't vilify her. He simply affirmed what I had already concluded. That night, I drafted a message. I didn't send it immediately. I reread it 3 times, not to soften it, not to sharpen it, but to ensure it contained no accusation. Only boundaries. Then I closed my planner. The decision had been made internally. The action would follow. There's a particular stillness that comes when you choose the irreversible path, not recklessly, but deliberately. I slept well that night, because for the first time in months, I wasn't managing perception. I was protecting alignment. I didn't send the message that night. Timing matters. The wedding was the next afternoon. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. I woke early, before the sun had fully lifted over the water, made tea, and reviewed the day's schedule one final time. Hair and makeup at 9, photographer arrival at noon, guests seated by 3:30, steady. At 8:30, before the house began to fill with movement, I sent Eleanor the message. Not emotional, not long. I need to make an adjustment for today. Given the changes made without my approval this week, I'm not comfortable having you serve as maid of honor. You're still invited. I'd like you there as my sister, but Amara will be standing beside me at the ceremony. I read it once more. No blame, no adjectives, just clarity. I pressed send. Then I placed my phone face down and continued preparing. Silence lasted exactly 4 minutes. Her call came through. I let it ring. Then a text. Are you serious? I waited. Another. You're doing this on your wedding day? I responded only once. Yes, I need the day to feel aligned. We can talk after. That was all. No defense, no back and forth. Within minutes, my mother called, her voice tight, confused. What's happening? I've reassigned the maid of honor role, I said evenly. The ceremony will proceed as planned. You can't change things now, she whispered. I already have. There is something disarming about calm certainty. It leaves little room for escalation. Amara arrived at 9. I took her aside privately. I need you to stand with me today, I said. Her eyes searched mine, not for gossip, but for temperature. Is this what you want? She asked. Yes, she nodded. Then I'm with you. No theatrics, no shock. Just acceptance. By 10:30, word had traveled through the bridal suite. The energy shifted, curious, unsettled, but not chaotic. Eleanor arrived just before noon. She didn't slam doors. She didn't shout. She walked in composed, face carefully arranged. So, she said quietly, pulling me aside, you're replacing me. I'm adjusting the role, I corrected gently. You're humiliating me. I'm protecting my peace. We held each other's gaze. For a moment, I saw something unfamiliar in her expression. Not rage, disorientation, because I wasn't reacting emotionally. I wasn't accusing her publicly. I wasn't performing righteousness. I was simply moving forward without her in that position. The photographer arrived. The timeline proceeded. Vendors followed the updated contact list seamlessly because I had prepared for this possibility days ago. No one asked questions during the ceremony rehearsal. No one challenged the shift. Titles matter less than composure. At 3:30, guests were seated. At 4 o'clock, I walked down the aisle. Amara stood beside me. Eleanor sat in the second row with my parents. The ceremony was exactly as Daniel and I had designed it. Warm light, soft florals, steady vows. No spectacle, no extended entrances, no elevated stage. Drama didn't make it down the aisle, and neither did doubt. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they arrive as absence. After the ceremony, during the soft hum of cocktail hour, I began to notice it, the subtle recalibration of the room. No one mentioned the change directly, but people felt it. Eleanor moved through the reception space gracefully, speaking to guests, smiling for photographs. If anyone asked about the adjustment, she answered lightly, Hazel wanted something simpler. It was a careful phrasing, not accusatory, but not entirely neutral either. What struck me wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't control anymore. The DJ followed the original playlist. The lighting remained warm and restrained. The seating flowed exactly as planned. There were no dramatic entrances, no amplified spectacle. And without those elements, something else surfaced. Intimacy. Guests lingered in conversation instead of watching a show. Daniel's grandmother cried quietly during our vows, not because of grandeur, but because she could hear every word. For the first time in months, the wedding felt like ours. I saw it in Daniel's expression during dinner. He leaned toward me and whispered, It feels calm. That word again, calm. But this time it wasn't mistaken for passivity. It felt intentional. Across the room, Eleanor watched. Not constantly, not obsessively. But occasionally, I'd catch her scanning the space as if searching for something that wasn't happening. The reception didn't spiral into chaos. It didn't erupt into drama. It unfolded steadily. And that steadiness was the quiet consequence. Because without friction, without spectacle, her usual way of expanding had nowhere to anchor. During speeches, Amara spoke briefly and warmly. Daniel's best man followed. When it came time for Eleanor, because I hadn't revoked her speech invitation, she stood. She was eloquent, charming, funny, but something had shifted. The narrative she'd been building for months, that I was restrained, overly cautious, in need of elevation, no longer fit the room. Because the room was already aligned. She began with humor, a few playful references to my structured tendencies, light laughter. Then she paused. And, she added more softly, Hazel has always known exactly who she is. The sentence hung differently. It wasn't framed as limitation. It was acknowledgement. I watched her carefully. That was the first time I sensed it. The subtle realization that the story she'd been shaping no longer held authority. Not because I argued, not because I exposed her emails, but because I removed the platform. After the cake was cut and the dance floor opened, guests relaxed fully into the evening. There were no forced moments, no orchestrated spectacles, just movement, music, joy. Eleanor stayed until the end. She didn't leave early. She didn't cause a scene. But she was quieter than I'd ever seen her at an event. And I understood something important then. Consequences aren't always punishments. Sometimes they are simply the removal of misplaced access. The wedding ended as it began, calm. When Daniel and I returned home that night, exhausted but steady, he asked, "Do you regret it?" I didn't hesitate. No, because the absence of drama wasn't emptiness. It was space. And for the first time in this entire process, the space belonged to me. The morning after the wedding felt unusually still, not because something had broken, but because something had finalized. Daniel and I were leaving for a short honeymoon in the Cotswolds the next afternoon. The house was quiet, half-packed suitcases resting by the door. I was seated at the kitchen table with tea when my phone lit up. Eleanor. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice wasn't angry. It was tight. I need to understand what happened. There it was. Not accusation, not outrage. Disorientation. I told you what happened? I replied evenly. I wasn't comfortable with the decisions being made without me. I was trying to help, she insisted. You always underplay things. I thought you'd appreciate it later. I didn't. A pause. You could have told me sooner. I considered that carefully. I did, I said, when I reverted the floor plan, when I corrected the timeline. That's not the same as removing me. No, I agreed. It isn't. There was a tremor in her next breath. Not tears, but the edge of them. You embarrassed me. I didn't rush to soothe her. I adjusted a role, I said calmly. You were still there. You still spoke. No one was publicly shamed. You know that's not how it felt. I believed her. It probably did feel humiliating. To lose proximity. To lose symbolic authority. To sit instead of stand. But feelings don't erase patterns. I needed the day to feel aligned, I repeated. And it did. Silence again. For the first time in our lives, I wasn't cushioning the discomfort. Not attacking. Not apologizing for boundaries. Just holding them. I didn't realize you felt that strongly, she said finally. That's because I usually don't act, I replied. The truth settled between us. She had operated on a long-standing assumption that my calmness equaled compliance, that my silence equaled permission, that I would always choose harmony over authorship. And for years, she had been right, until she wasn't. You could have trusted me, she said quietly. I needed to trust myself first. That was the part she hadn't expected. There was no dramatic fallout after that call, no family rupture, no sides chosen. But something irreversible had occurred. The dynamic had shifted permanently. Later that afternoon, Mum called, softer this time. She was hurt, she said. I know. You don't feel guilty? I searched myself honestly. No, I answered. I feel clear. And clarity, once experienced, is difficult to surrender. By the time Daniel and I drove out of Brighton the next day, the tension had settled into something less volatile, more reflective. It was too late to fix the ceremony, too late to reclaim the title. But this wasn't about a wedding role anymore. It was about the end of an old assumption, that I would always absorb the imbalance, that I would always translate discomfort into understanding. I had changed the script without raising my voice, and there was no way to undo that. Not because I wanted distance, but because once someone sees you act decisively, they can't pretend you're harmless anymore. We didn't see each other alone until 3 weeks after the wedding. By then, the photos had been delivered. Thank you cards were half written. Life had begun folding back into its ordinary rhythms. Daniel returned to work. I reopened my planner, not for crisis management, but for grocery lists and quarterly deadlines. Eleanor asked to meet for coffee, not at our parents' house, not in a crowded brunch spot, a quiet cafe near the marina. When I arrived, she was already seated. No dramatic posture, no defensive tension, just thoughtful. "You look rested," she said. "I am." We ordered. Saturday. Waited. She didn't circle the subject this time. "I've been replaying everything," she began, "and I need to know, was I trying to sabotage you?" The question was direct. I appreciated that. "I don't think you were trying to ruin anything," I said carefully. "I think you were trying to shape it." She absorbed that. "That sounds worse." "It depends on intention," I replied, "but intention doesn't erase impact." She stared into her coffee. "I've always been the expressive one," she said. "You've always been steady. I thought that meant you didn't mind." "There's a difference between not minding and not reacting," I said. That landed. For once, I wasn't translating her behavior into something harmless. I wasn't cushioning it with humor, but I wasn't attacking either. "You made decisions without me," I continued calmly. "You reframed my choices publicly. You positioned yourself as correcting me. Maybe you didn't see it that way, but that's how it functioned." She didn't interrupt. "And when I realized it was consistent," I added, "I stopped assuming it was accidental." A flicker crossed her face, not anger, but recognition. "I didn't think you'd ever pull something like that," she admitted, removing me. "That's the point," I said quietly. We held eye contact. There it was. The real shift. For years, she had relied on a version of me that absorbed imbalance, that prioritized comfort, that avoided disruption. When I acted differently, it felt shocking, not because it was cruel, but because it broke expectation. "You could have talked to me," she said. "I could have," I agreed, "but I needed to see if you would stop without being asked." And when I didn't, I adjusted accordingly. There was no raised voice, no tears. Just two adults sitting with a revised understanding of each other. She leaned back in her chair. "I felt small," she said finally, "sitting there instead of standing beside you." I didn't dismiss that. "I felt small for years," I replied gently, "just not publicly." That was the closest we came to something raw, not dramatic, but honest. After a long pause, she nodded once. "I didn't know." "I know," I said, and I meant it. We finished our coffee in relative quiet, not cold, not repaired, but recalibrated. Because confrontation doesn't require volume. Sometimes it requires stillness strong enough to hold truth without flinching. And for the first time in our lives, I wasn't flinching. People assume moments like that wedding redefine you overnight. They don't. They reveal what was already waiting. In the months that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No permanent rift, no theatrical reconciliation. Eleanor and I settled into something new, less automatic, more deliberate. She asks before assuming now. I answer without cushioning. The dynamic isn't fragile. It's simply clearer. What changed most wasn't her behavior. It was my tolerance threshold. I no longer translate sharpness into affection. I no longer mistake charisma for authority. And I no longer confuse silence with virtue. For years, I believed being steady meant being endlessly accommodating. That composure required absorption. That maturity meant enduring without adjustment. But steadiness isn't submission. It's alignment. There's a quiet confidence that comes from acting once, decisively, and seeing that the world doesn't collapse. My parents didn't disown me. The guests didn't whisper for months. The wedding photos didn't carry tension. In fact, when I look at them now, what I see most clearly is ease. I see Daniel's shoulders relaxed. I see myself fully present, not scanning for interference, not bracing for commentary, just present, and that presence was worth the discomfort. Eleanor once told me years ago that I let life happen. I used to think that was praise. Now I understand something different. I let life happen when it aligns, and I intervene when it doesn't. There's no bitterness in me when I think about the wedding day. No triumph either. Removing her wasn't a victory, it was a correction. And corrections don't require celebration. They require consistency afterward. These days, when I enter a room, I don't rush to manage its tone. I don't anticipate the emotional shifts of others before my own. If I'm quiet, it's because I choose to be. If I speak, it's because I mean it. The leather planner still travels with me everywhere. Not as armor, not as defense, as structure. But I no longer use structure to contain myself. I use it to support myself. There's a subtle difference. I used to be perceived as the harmless one, the reasonable one, the one who would always understand. Now I'm still reasonable, but I'm not assumed. And that distinction matters. Because quiet doesn't mean compliant. Calm doesn't mean small. And steadiness, when owned deliberately, is a form of power. When people hear that I removed my sister as maid of honor an hour before the ceremony, they expect chaos in the story. They expect shouting, tears, a dramatic aisle interruption, but none of that happened. What happened was quieter, and in my opinion, far more significant. I stopped confusing peace with self-erasure. Family dynamics are powerful because they're old. Roles get assigned early, reinforced casually, and rarely questioned. The responsible one, the dramatic one, the easygoing one. Over time, those labels stop feeling descriptive and start feeling permanent. But they aren't permanent. They're patterns, and patterns only continue when everyone involved keeps playing their part. Removing Eleanor as maid of honor wasn't about punishing her. It wasn't about humiliating her in front of guests. It wasn't revenge disguised as empowerment. It was a boundary, enforced without spectacle. Drama didn't make it down the aisle. Clarity did. What I learned through that experience is simple, but not easy. You don't have to explode to be taken seriously. You don't have to expose someone publicly to correct privately. And you don't have to sacrifice your milestone moments to protect someone else's comfort. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment. It's about knowing who you are clearly enough that when someone tries to reshape you, even subtly, you notice. And when you notice, you decide. Not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly. If you've ever been the steady one, the reasonable one, the one expected to understand, ask yourself this: are you keeping peace, or are you keeping yourself small? I genuinely love to know your thoughts. Have you ever had to enforce a boundary in a way that surprised people, not because it was cruel, but because it was calm?